This video world, I am SYED and you're watching Faultlines. Pakistan's national budget has been presented in the parliament on 10th of June 2022. This budget has been presented at a time when Pakistan's economy was facing some serious and dire challenges. There was a very serious risk of default hovering on the head of the country. And the government in charge at the moment is a coalition of many parties. Each party has a different economic agenda, all of them coming together and presenting a budget with consensus on various areas where there can be difference of opinion is in itself a commendable thing to be done. Important points in this budget have been discussed in various programs on various television channels, including ours. But in today's program, we are going to see the overall outlook of this budget and try to understand what the government is exactly trying to achieve from this budget of 2022-23. My first guest in today's program is Mr. SHARUKH. He's an economist from Oxford University and joining me on Skype. Mr. SHARUKH, I welcome you to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Mr. Wani, before we discuss the budget in specific, help me to understand the backdrop, the economic environment and the economic risks that Pakistan was facing before the budget was presented, so we can understand the backdrop of all the initiatives that the government has decided to take.
Okay, that's a very good question, and it's really important to understand. So the premise where we are at right now is that the economy expanded by just under 6% last year, but as the problem is the way Pakistan's economy grows, whenever it grows beyond 5%, our external account, so our import bill becomes really high, and we really struggle to cover that. So that's sort of the backdrop for this budget too, is that the main constraint and the main focus for the government right now is to get the resumption of the IMF program, get bilateral flows, raise foreign debt, so it can expand its import cover. So it's able to pay for imports and also debt repayments, which they have to pay in sort of foreign currency, mainly dollars. So that's sort of the main institutional background. The budget sort of comes after.
And also the fact that Pakistan was facing a very serious trade deficit of $45 billion, something that was pushing the country to the line of default.
Yeah, so the trend, we weren't, well, default was a bit way off, but we do, so the twin deficit is basically this. It's a deficit between exports and imports. So whenever our economy, we get GDP growth, our imports skyrocket, but because the way our economy is structured domestically and the fact that we haven't reformed the economy across political cycles, we up our consumption whenever growth goes beyond 5%, and we are not able to export. Our industries are not able to export in the corresponding stat. So that's sort of the core problem. And of course, there's a domestic deficit problem, which became worse because of the petroleum subsidies given by the previous administration. But domestic deficit is slightly more manageable as opposed to foreign deficit, because you can it's much easier to raise domestic debt because you have to finance it in rupees. For raising foreign debt, especially in this global environment right now, without an IMF program, is really, really hard. So that was sort of the main constraint the government is facing. And this is basically the problem Pakistan has faced. This is not something which is new right now. It's something we have faced for decades, or several governments. So in 2017-18, we had the same problem. In 2012-2013, we had the same problem. In 2006-07, we had the same problem. In 1999, we had the same problem. So this is nothing new. And the reason why we have the problem is because we refuse to reform the fundamentals of our economy. And as long as we continue to do that, we will be in the same exact boat 3 years from now, even after resuming the IMF program.
Mr. Mani, the budget document, all the speeches that have been, the speech that has been made by the finance minister, the other speeches made by other ministers, and then the criticism that we are listening on all the media outlets. You know, putting all of this together, tell me briefly, what does the budget tell you? That what exactly the government is trying to achieve in the next 12 financial months?
So the government is trying to get some sort of a balance So the budget's, I know it's slightly weird to say, but the budget's main, the budget has two audiences basically at this point. One is the IMF, and the other are the people of Pakistan and all the politics around that. So it tries to achieve some sort of a balance between the two. So it has to decrease the deficit. It has to decrease both the budget deficit, and it also has these trade deficit goals reductions. It has to increase revenue. In order to get that in control, because that's a condition that's going to be a condition as part of the resumption of the IMF program. But at the same time, because Pakistan is very likely going to go into elections by this year or next year, it has to also deliver some sort of relief, you can say, but some sort of a growth and expansion of fiscal policy domestically. So the government has to spend money ahead of elections. Otherwise, the downturn would be too high. And that, of course, is compounded by the fact that inflation is very high. So it tries to achieve that. I don't know how successful it is, because budgets are basically like promissory notes. And there's a lot of big ifs in determining if they're going to be successful in doing this or not. For instance, on the budget deficit, the government assumes a lot of things. So it says we will bring down imports by about $6 or $7 billion. But when you bring down imports, much of Pakistan's taxes through the FBR are collected at import stage. So if you bring down imports, your tax revenue will also go down, but you need to increase the tax revenue. Similarly, they say that we will increase petroleum levy. Right now, that will increase petroleum cost, and that's going to be very hard to do, especially with bringing down the inflation, which all the government has also targeted a significantly lower inflation than what I and others believe will be much higher, probably around 20%. So there's a lot of let's say, contradictory forces in the budget, and it'll be really hard to manage it over the coming few months. Uh, but again, historically, Pakistani governments don't really follow the budget that much. They follow it for a few months, and then they will try to deviate from their own budget very quickly, and they might have to do it in order to meet the budget deficit. And when that happens, and the things which get cut, they're not going to be salaries and pensions for government employees and recurring costs. What gets cut is then things like PSDP, which is the main public investment sort of fund, and that will also drag down economic growth. So you won't be able to get 5% GDP growth, so it will be much lower than that.
One of the most remarkable things in this budget that the government is set to achieve is a contraction in the imports. Now, from $75 billion in a year, they want to contract it down to 70 billion. That becomes almost somewhere between 9 to 10%. You also spoke about it as one of the major challenges. The import-led economy is becoming a problem. I mean, this entire economic system is becoming unviable for Pakistan's government. So how do you believe the government can accomplish this? Will it not just create many other problems as the entire world is facing supply chain issues?
So it's the contraction in imports won't be easy, but if you're getting a contraction in growth, so the last year the growth was nearly 6%. If you get half of that, so you get 3% growth, and your incomes don't rise in the same way, and people's purchasing power is eroded, and then it will be eroded considering fuel prices and significant increase in cost of living, which we're about to experience. So that makes it easy to decrease imports. So there's going to be some management through that angle, but that doesn't solve the fundamental problem. That's a bandit you're putting over a sort of over a sliced leg or something. The problem is basically you can't export. Your exports are the problem. So you're trying to target $35 billion of exports. That's just over half of what you're planning to bring your imports down to. So unless you do structural reforms and you try to look at the economy, and as you said very, very rightly, that the growth model is not sustainable. It's not been sustainable for decades. And the only reason it's sustained is because every few years, the IMF and a number of friendly countries to Pakistan bail us out. But this time, it's much harder to get us those bailout money. So hopefully it is a point of self-reflection, for not only the government, but for the broader leadership, which includes the business leadership in Pakistan, to try to restructure the economic incentives in a way that Pakistani firms go out and compete with other global firms and try to build tap into supply chains, try to produce product and services which other people want, and to move away from a model where we sort of consume act like this sort of consumer rentier state in which we sort of consume whenever we get a bit of economic growth. And one of the things which I find very promising, although I think it's going to be very administratively challenging, and I think it's going to be challenging codes very soon, is an increase in taxation on property. And that's one of the things which could help in fixing the sort of structural imbalance in Pakistan, where a lot of capital moves into the real estate sector, which you can't export. So you can't export a really good corner plot, even if it's a really, really good plot, but no one's going to buy it. You can't sell it to someone in Turkey or Germany. So you need to move capital away from that and into sort of building productive manufacturing capacity. And that's sort of where the focus has to be. And that's, in a way, that's the real test for the government. So I think of this in two ways. Over the coming 12 months, the test for the government is twofold. First is that they need to get the IMF program up and running and manage the macro front. They have to manage the fact that the fiscal, so the trade deficit doesn't go out of hand, and they have enough money to cover sort of all the sort of money they have to give either to pay for imports or sort of to service their foreign debt. So they need to manage that. And if that requires going to Saudi Arabia or going to X number of countries and trying to borrow more money to make sure that front is stabilized, they will have to do that. The second thing, and that's the challenging part they need to be judged at, is the fact that are they going to do something different? Are they going to take Pakistan out of this vicious cycle of sort of economic chaos every 3 years? Are they going to sit down and work with different business leaders and say that we need to change the incentive the economic structure gives? That's a very, very difficult thing to do, and they can't do everything at the same time, but they can at least start on the direction. And if we are able to do that, then we will be much better placed in 3 years or 4 years down the line, and probably we might not even need another IMF program. Or if we do need it, it will be on a much more softer condition because our macro and micro conditions will be much more better.
As you very aptly pointed out, the government is trying to strike a balance between IMF and the demands of the people of this country to be able to run this country in a right manner. You also pointed out that the government is quite close to elections. Perhaps this will be the last budget. Anytime in next year, we will have the elections. So while striking a balance between IMF and the demands of the people of this country, do you believe it will eventually become very difficult to squeeze more money out of the existing economy that you said government would be trying to slow down? And meanwhile, we have revised our tax targets as well from 8.6% tax to GDP ratio. We are trying to achieve 9.2% while doing an effort to slow down the economy, but while doing an effort to contract the imports. So don't you think this will actually squeeze the existing tax base a bit too much?
So the government has a question to answer. So right now, the targets they're setting for tax. So the main thing that budget does is determines where you get the money from. Spending is always easier. And a lot of the ways the government is promising or sort of expecting to raise revenue is not really going to be that easy, right? So whether that's the sales tax targets they're setting up, the petroleum levy targets they're setting up, which are going to be quite unrealistic to meet. But the government has a bigger question to answer here, whether they're going to push further tax burden on people, either through indirect taxes, which are highly regressive, so the poor or working and middle classes pay more than the richer do as a proportion to their income, and the very few people, million odd people who file direct income taxes, or they're going to move towards more substantial reforms to the tax system by broadening the tax base, by creating further information trails, trying to fix the country's sales and services, the VAT system, which is split between federal and provincial governments. They need to, so there's a question here, whether they're going to go towards targeting people who have for years been either left out fully or partially from the tax system, or are they going to burden the sort of the masses who are going to be increasingly squeezed because they will have far less disposable income, far less income, period, this year than they had last year. So this is a question for the government to sort of consider. And it's not an easy thing to do, right? So it's much easier to increase the sales tax, even though it harms poorer more, but because it's easier to implement. And but if you go and let's say you're going to target significantly taxation on people who own very large land, urban land or agriculture income, or try to expand sales tax to certain businesses and traders who have for years been very, very powerful in lobbying for not that expansion to happen. That's going to be very tricky to manage, but that is something that the country they need to do. Otherwise, the burden is going to fall on ordinary Pakistanis once again, and that's the big challenge.
Government, Mr. Wani, is also trying to give some more attention to the export sector. The document that is available with me is telling me that they're looking at expansion in the current export base of the country. But that said, the fuel prices are going high, the electricity prices are going high, the target for inflation set at 11%. To most of the economists, this will be a major challenge to keep the inflation under check. So do you believe that it's another host of issues that the government has to address to make sure that the export targets are met amid all the international involvement that we have at the moment?
So, particularly on the inflation, I should say, I agree with sort of what is now broadly the consensus among economists, Pakistani economists, that you can't get 11% inflation. It's already higher than that, and that doesn't even factor the current increase in fuel prices. And if the government's budget is to believe they're going to put tax on fuel, so that's going to even further fuel prices. So that's going to be highly implausible to meet. The export sector, the export competitiveness of the economy, is something you can't. So there has been expansion of exports over the past few years, and in part because of sort of changes in the regulatory environment, but also on the changes in how the currency was valued. But the deeper structural issues to the export competitiveness has to be sort of solved in order for that to happen in a substantial manner that it can cover our imports. You can probably get like a bump in exports somehow. So you can get certain marginal increase in exports, a few $1 billion through either targeted support or through targeted, some of this will come down to luck if there's a global market and global demand for certain product which Pakistan produces. But the country does need a much broader set of reforms around on how to make Pakistani exports more competitive. And that starts with a few things. So that starts with incentive structure. So are Pakistani firms incentivized to export or not in the first place? A lot of firms are not because of the import barriers. Firms get effectively a captive market in Pakistan, so they can sell very low value-added products on much higher premiums, proportionally higher premiums to domestic markets. So they can get basically a ready-made car, assemble it, and sell it to domestic market where there's very little competition because the government bars imports of cars. Why would they ask them to try to sell one of the Suzuki Altos to, let's say, to Saudi Arabia or to Turkey? And you will figure it out how that's not possible and feasible. So that sort of entire incentive structure has to be tweaked and moved towards the other direction, that you encourage firms to go and compete globally. And that's exactly how other countries have developed, like Taiwan, South Korea, all the Asian tigers, but even more newly industrialized countries like Malaysia and others have actually grown through building on specific areas very competitive export-focused industries, and then importing other things which they can't export. And then the other things are endowments. What kind of resources do firms have in Pakistan to actually go and export? And that requires thinking about the finance system. Do they have access to finance? What kind of incentive structure that builds? Do they have access to secure legal rights? So if they go to a court, if there's a problem there, will they get solution within a single lifetime? They need to think about education sector. They need to think about connectivity and transport, which is a really important one. How do people move within cities, and expanding Pakistan's railway freight infrastructure? What kind of cost of energy there is? So there's lots of things which need to be fixed, and that's why if it was easy, then every country would be really rich. But it's not easy. You have to do all of this stuff to try to build the right environment to get sort of sustained export-focused growth, and that's what the focus needs to be moved towards.
Mr. Wani, one of the factors that you identified is the devaluation as well. That is going to, in a way, help the export industry as well. But that actually gives birth to another question. And the question is that most of the industrial inputs that we require for processing of our goods and then to re-export them abroad are coming from other countries in foreign currencies. Now, devaluation has become a haunting phenomena for the economy. During last 2 months, ever since the new government has come, and we have already lost 23 rupees of value of Pakistani rupee versus US dollar. How concerned, as an economic expert you are, with the phenomena of devaluation as dollar is also rising in international market? Side by side, the fact remains that the rupee is also under pressure, while we are importing more than exports are at the moment.
So the principal concern around this is, of course, two things. One is that a lot of Pakistan is that how there's an inflationary impact, and then it also makes it harder for debt servicing, especially if it's dollar dominated, or any obligations the government has which is tied to dollars, and that includes some of the independent power projects. So that's sort of the main area of concern. The reason why Pakistani currency has sort of devalued so much is because of supply and demand, because of delays in increasing fuel prices most recently, because of political instability. The demand for dollar in the and versus the rupee has sort of changed. The government shouldn't intervene in that sense to try to overvalue the rupee, because then it ends up in another problem of making Pakistani exports less competitive. What it needs to do is fix the structural issues and provide macroeconomic stability. If it does that, if there's stability and more certainty around the direction Pakistan's economy is taking, I'm very hopeful that the rupee will gain some of the value back. It's not that's the way to look at this sort of currency and exchange rate, rather than looking at it as something that the government should actively intervene to try to fix. It should fix the fundamentals. It should fix the uncertainty problem. It should fix the risk premium and the risk problem in Pakistani market and investment. And then it depends on the markets. If people want to buy rupees, then the rupees value will go up. But sort of using what we have done in the past is using treasury money and state bank resources to actively go and buy the rupee to overvalue it, and that has led to a mass drag in our export competitiveness. So I would look at it as from a slightly different angle, and I think that's the way we should approach it from. It is concerning that it lost so much value so quickly, but it's not because, and it's largely because of uncertainty. And I hope that with the resumption of the IMF program, the budget, that certainty should come back into the market, and the market would react positively, and you would get a bit of a change in the opposite direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. SHARUKH, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Mr. SHARUKH from Oxford University. He made some important point, but most important point out of all of his conversation is about the risk that Pakistan have at the moment, and the government needs to take a lot of steps to keep all these statistics under control. We'll keep the conversation going, but after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. To join me in this part of the program is Dr. Mahmood Khalid. He's Senior Research Economist at Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Dr. Mahmood, I welcome you to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for calling me.
So, we are discussing the budget 2022-23. And while discussing the budget, we want to now get into the numbers and see how this entire budget is going to affect the life of common people in this country. Because we understand this budget has been presented at a time when the economic situation was quite challenging. So, how would you comment on the economic environment that the government had before presenting this budget?
Well, this is something which we really need to understand because often the budgets are just seen in the context of the common man's perspective, but actually it's a whole kind of government's resource provision for the economic activities which are happening around us, and that basically reflects into what sort of a situation we are currently now. And the situation at present now is the international scenario is such that the energy prices are going up, and that has led to an international kind of a recessionary phase into which the world is moving. On top of that, the problem with our sort of an economy is that whenever we try to improve in terms of our economic growth, we always have the slippages in the form of the current account deficits. This is what we have observed for the last 2 years as well, that whenever we have touched a growth base of above 3% in real terms, we always see that we have to basically borrow resources from the world in the form of the raw materials and other goods which we are consuming in our economy. So, given that situation, we had to go to the IMF, and under the IMF program, we have to actually keep our budget spendings at a level which is reflecting the kind of credibility of the government in terms of long term containment for the problems such as the current account deficit and the fiscal slippages. So, that was a pretty tight situation under which the present government, despite the fact that this is their last year as in the parliament, in the sense that it's going to be replaced next year, so they had to be very careful in terms of what they're committing, considering the situation and going forth into the future.
Would you like to comment on the expenditure outlay presented in this budget? Because this is something that actually requires some explanation by an expert economist.
Yes, yes, sure. If we broadly see the expenditures, I'll just pick some of them which are very key in terms of their weightage in the overall expenditure. So, what first of all, what we see is that our domestic interest payment has really gone up, and this happened since 2018 onwards, when we started to reprofile our debt from the short-term debt towards the long-term debt. And unfortunately, since in 2019 and onwards, the interest rates, the policy rates were going up. So whatever we reprofiled, actually, that has hit in terms of our domestic interest payments which we have to make. So if you look at the present allocations towards the this interest repayment, this is the highest in terms of the single entity of the expenditures, and it is close to 4 trillion, which is about more than 40% of our budget. So this is something which really bothers us in terms of going into the future as well, because it is increasing day by day. Then the second biggest expenditure in terms of the nature of the expenditure, which one has to be very careful, is the pension payments. And that has also been increasing over time. And this year it has spiraled close to 530 billion. Then we have the regular affairs of the governments, which are kind of contributive in terms of the overall economic and other services which the governments are providing, such as the defense services. It had some increase, but it was not that much. Another bigger element in terms of the expenditures is basically the subsidies portion. Uh, in the last year, we did not anticipated the increase in the petroleum prices by that much. So the government had to go overboard. But the subsidies problem is a chronic problem. It's not just related to the energy subsidies which the government has paid last year and trying to continue to an extent this year as well. Basically, we have to provide the subsidies in the form of the inter disco tariff differentials as well. where the government is providing subsidies in terms of the differences for the rates of the electricity which is charged to the consumers of commercial and other natures. And besides that, there are commodity operations in which the government procures for the food security and the welfare of the farmer, the wheat and other stocks. That also involves big subsidies. So this year, the subsidy is estimated to be close to 700 billion. So, if you compare the other forms of the expenditure, such as running of the civil government, that's very small, and that is around 550 billion rupees. So, with a total outlay of close to 9 trillion, we see that the major chunk of our expenditures are going towards those activities which are not very contributive in the present economic situation. So, the government had to really play very smart in this situation.
Dr. Mahmood, as you have also mentioned previously, all of this comes from tax and other revenue outlets that the government has. Now, the government, while has gone for more expenditure, as you pointed out, more than 700 billion alone on the subsidies, they have also taken some years to increase the tax base. Are you happy with the tax base broadening measures that have been taken by the government? And besides, do you believe these are the right steps to be taken at the time when we are trying to slow down our economy?
Well, actually, for the time being, it's the finance bill which has been tabled in the parliament. There would, of course, be debate and it is going to be discussed thoroughly. The tax measures which they have taken are in the right direction. I'm not going to comment in terms of the exact legality because for specific taxes such as the real estate, there is still a confusion because the FBR has pointed it out in terms of the income which the properties are supposed to earn in a kind of a presumptive way. And whenever you talk about the incomes related to the property, it becomes the matter of the provincial governments to procure it in the form of the urban immovable property tax and others. So I'm not sure that how the FPR is going to tackle about that. But if you look at the finance bill, the overall tone is very good because they have taken away certain exemptions from this, and also they have tried to increase the overall base. And there are certain administrative measures as well, which was not highlighted in the budget debate, but it is presented in the form of the printed material, such as there had been powers which are given to the commissioners in terms of giving notices to those eligible individuals which should file returns, such as having a house or having plot more than of 10 marlas, and there are the electricity bill being above 40,000. There are certain restrictions which basically requires by law that you have to file the return. So now the commissioners authorized that they can basically instruct the utility providers that they can cut off the utility supplies to that individual or the businesses. So there are administrative measures, and they have tried to spell out certain policy measures as well in order to broaden the tax base and the resource collection. But still, I believe as an economist and what we have worked at PIDE as well, that the overall policy needs to be simplified. Because if you look at the overall structure of the tax, it's very complex. Say, for example, if you are a businessman and you have to pay the income tax, you have to go through about 700 pages of pure legal wordings in order to know that what is your actual liability in terms of the taxes. So there needs to be a lot of work done, especially with regards to the overall legislation. The track and trace system needs to be very efficient, and that is something which was missing in the present budget items. But overall, the tone of the financing side was also, I think, is on the right track, or it is good.
Let me be a bit more specific in what I was trying to say. Now, more than 52% of the total tax revenue being collected is at the import stage. Now, what does
Yeah.
that mean, and how does it affect the shrinkage of export that the government is intending to achieve?
Well, this is something very interesting and also worrisome because when we say that the almost 52 to close to 60% of our tax is coming from the import stage, what we mean is that it's not just the customs which we collect from the imports. there is the general sales tax also, which is collected from the items which are imported, and there are certain withholding taxes which are basically parked in the income tax or the direct taxes, which is also collected at the import side. So if you look at the overall referencing of the revenues coming from a particular source, then it is close to, as you mentioned, 52% and even above than that. So that is something which is very worrisome. And when you look at the government's policy to curb the external trade from the import side, so that also has a fiscal risk towards it, because whenever you try to reduce the imports, that is ultimately going to affect your tax collections as well. So from the resource collection side, that's an issue in terms of having higher resources, and on the other side, we are trying to manage our current account deficit. But having said that, when we are too much dependent on the import side, that basically also reflects that whatever the changes the government is going to do in terms of its import base, in terms of the taxation, it is going to affect the overall pricing and other mechanisms which would flow along with it, because most of the imports which we are doing from the rest of the world is either the inputs or the final product, so it is going to reflect in terms of the prices as well.
Dr. 750 billion the government intends to generate from petroleum development levy,
Yeah.
and there are no taxes or no income being made by the government at the moment on the petroleum products that are being sold on the historically highest prices. What does that statistic tell you?
Well, when we are making the budgets, that's the irony, because often, whenever, especially in the under the IMF program, we have to show that we are very good in terms of planning as per our targets which are given to us. So from that perspective, they have basically put such a big amount in the possible tax to be collected. But as you have just mentioned, that we don't see it in the likely future, because the international prices for oil are not receding for the time being. Still, it is trading close to $122 per barrel, even more. So we don't see that, at least in the first fiscal quarter, there is going to be likely impact. However, maybe going forth in the future, when the international geopolitical situations cool down, or maybe if the international regime also allows imports from those countries from where earlier imports were not allowed, such as Iran, or maybe having other source of supplies, then the government can think about it. But for the time being, it's a too ambitious kind of a thing, and this is one of the features which puts doubt in terms of the credibility, whether they would be able to meet the target or not.
But Dr. Just in case we are unable, just in case if we are unable,
Yeah.
because internationally you see the petroleum prices are likely to go high. We have done many programs on this and we have invited many experts from abroad. So if it happens and we are unable to put this much taxes on the existing prices of petrol, don't you believe that IMF will make it far more difficult for us to take more money in the future, because with such mistakes, or with such massively missing the target from such massive margins, will just make it more difficult for government to negotiate the next tranche of loan.
You're absolutely right, because I'll point this issue further, is that if you look at the overall budget documents this year, there is another document which is tabled in the parliament, which is related to the excess provisionings for different types of expenditures which has been made by the government in the year 2018, 19, and 2021. Now, having said that, what that means is that the fiscal planning capacity really needs to improve, because that is something which is very obvious, that whenever they're putting up certain figures, the assumptions which they're taking are too unrealistic. Unfortunately, we don't have good policy making, in the sense that we do not take the assumptions to be in the right direction, or at least we don't do a kind of a sensitivity analysis, that what if a situation comes up. For example, I've just mentioned the excess expenditures. They have come out after the additional expenditures which the governments had to make because of the ad hoc relief which the government has provided. So if you have expenditure, or you are short of certain revenues which otherwise should happen, that is going to put pressure on you, especially the government making policies which we call as the mini budget, which would be more troublesome. So my take on this would be that if we should cut it down to a realistic figure, maybe about 300 billion should be the safe limit, and if we can make more out of that, so that would be good. But instead of making large claims, which might put up in the end put us into a position where we have to cut down on our necessary expenditures, such as the development budget, that should not happen. Because if you see in the last budget, this is also what happened, that we started off with a 900 billion worth of the PSDP budget, but we ended up at 530 billion. And in the last quarter, we couldn't make any payment at all to any project which was running. And that actually leads to cost escalation, time escalation, and so many other problems with the development projects which are going on. So one has to be very realistic and do not make such loose assumptions.
So just in case if the targets aren't met, are you skeptical about the current allocation of PSDP? You believe that this can again be compromised if the other targets are not met?
Absolutely, because this year they have set another bigger target. If you look at the past history, we have not been able to go above 550 billion for the last 5 6 years. So going up to close to 800 billion is still a very uphill task. And I believe that if there is a certain shortfall, so that would end up again cutting down the PSTP, and that is something which is going to perpetuate for future. There is a term called as the throw forward. Whenever there is an expenditure which should happen and you're not financing it, it does not only lead to cost escalation, but it also creates a forward pressure where you cannot initiate any new activity because there is something which you have to finance from the past. So for the time being, there is a throw forward of about 8 trillion rupees. And if you look at the budget allocations of about 500 to 600 billion, technically speaking, we should not announce any new project for the next maybe 5 6 budgets. But on top of that, if we are making such loose assumptions on our resource portion, ultimately it is going to affect the PSDP spending, and that creates more economic hurdles. Because for the time being, I believe that it is only the development spending which gives us a hope that the economic activity can really benefit from the government's intervention. Because the other expenditures, as I've just mentioned, are either the ones which are basically as a result of the past decision making, or they are not very much contributive in terms of the economic uplift of the country.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmood Khalid, for being guest in our program.
Pleasure, sir. Pleasure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Mahmood Khalid from Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Again, another expert who has a lot of optimism to show, but also is quite concerned that amid the international environment, amid all the international crises that we have, this budget might have many worries for economists like him. And all of us want to see Pakistan's government doing a commendable job in terms of accomplishments of the financial targets set forth in this budget. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.